Thank you. So on behalf of all gathered today, we would like to commence the ceremony by acknowledging the First Peoples, the traditional custodians of country where our universities are located. We recognise our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Peoples' continuing connection to land, place, waters and community. Their nations have faithfully cared for country for thousands of years. We pay our respects to their cultures, country and elders, past, present and emerging. We also recognise the unique role of Māori as tangata whenua and embrace Te Tiriti o Waitangi, recognising Māori as Tino Rangitiratanga of Aotearoa, New Zealand, while embracing the three guiding principles of the treaty: partnership, participation and protection. So welcome everybody. The session will be recorded, as you will have noted. Please use the chat bot to tell us where you are joining us from. And it gives me great pleasure to pass over to Romy Lawson, who's going to host the Bold Conversation today. Thanks, Catherine.
Well, it's a delight to be here and to be part of this first Bold Conversation with our patrons panel. I'm Romy Lawson. I'm based at Flinders University in Adelaide, so coming from Ghana Yata, and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Students. And we're joined today by the two patrons of ATAM, Barney Glover and Jan. And you know, they're two people that I could read a long bio for, and all their achievements that they've had over the years. But I think I'm going to summarise it in 4 points. First of all, they're both very highly respected Vice-Chancellors, Western Sydney University and Massey University. They're also patrons of ATAM, and I think ATAM are very lucky and privileged to have these two great characters as their patrons. Next, they've known each other for longer than they can say. And lastly, they both have had a lifelong love affair with universities. So 4 reasons why it's great to have them to be part of this first Bold Conversation. And I'm really looking forward to where the conversation goes. But we thought that because this was the first conversation that we're having from the patrons panel, it'd be worth just having a bit of a talk at the beginning to talk about what the role is of a patron, how the patrons see ATAM as having impact in the sector, and also what these panels and Bold Conversations are hoping to achieve. So Barney, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts on being a patron and the panel?
Thanks, Romy. It's great to be here, and wonderful to be on a panel with Jan. Jan and I have known each other for too long, and it's wonderful to have this trans-Tasman conversation as patrons. So great to see you, Jan, here, and thanks to Catherine and the team for setting this all up. I'd also like to acknowledge that today, Jan, Catherine and I are on the lands of the Barramatical people of the Darug Nation, here in Parramatta, in the centre of the Greater Sydney region, really Western Sydney, the centre of Sydney. And I want to acknowledge their elders past, present and future, and particularly welcome anyone of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or Maori descent who is joining us today from either Australia or New Zealand. The role of the patrons is a really interesting one, and I know that I was very, very pleased to be asked to take on the role. Partly because of my career path. Jan and I started working together when Jan was in WA and I was at Curtin, and Jan was at Murdoch, and there's PVCs and DVCs, and we've found our way through the sector in various ways through institutions in Australia and now New Zealand. But I began my career in research management after being an academic and a researcher in mathematics for many years, but I moved into research management and moved to Curtin. So I began to have a great deal to do with the professional staff of Curtin University, and then as a research management person in research management across Australia through the Australasian Research Management Society, which was a fledgling organisation when I started. So I realised the importance of professional associations to our staff in tertiary education management, whether it's research or any other part of our organisation. So to me, professional associations are vital, and I think it's great to see Vice-Chancellors who are prepared to play a senior role, advisory role, as patrons. I'm not sure the word is ideal, but we're champions and ambassadors for ATEM. Great to have an initiative like this today. And hopefully we can provide a bit of insight into some of these critical issues, and Jan and I can have some other bold conversations in the future about things impacting on higher education. So I'm very, very pleased to be here today.
Thanks, Barney. It's lovely to hear some of your journey. You know, we sometimes see people as vice-chancellors and we forget, you know, where they've come from and the different experiences they've had. So it's lovely that you've shared that with us. And also, you know, your strong connection with how we can support people in all the different areas that are so vital to us as a university moving forward. And just your enthusiasm, you can tell, you know, you'll see from both Barney and Jan, their enthusiasm for how they support ATEM moving forward. Jan, what are your thoughts?
Well, yes, it's far too long ago when Barney and I first ran into each other as fellow DVCs, but my interest in academia was, you know, absolute from a sort of a early career perspective, but my career followed particularly around teaching excellence, teaching development, curriculum development, and so on. And I became PVC academic at Murdoch Universities, where I met Barney. But that the whole learning environment, the totality of it, back in the day where we were still discussing teacher-centred learning environments and student-centred learning environments, thank goodness we're well past that. But it was entirely apparent that there were many, many people who influenced the student learning journey, not just academics and not just what happened in the classroom. And so the whole notion of professional staff member versus an academic staff member became very blurred once you look at the entire experience of a student. And so for me, being able to support in whatever way is useful, an association that enables, develops and shares good practice across the sector around the broader management of universities, I think is really important. So I'm really happy to do whatever I'm asked to do to support this sort of initiative. And hopefully, you know, all the years of making wrong decisions that Barney and I have made over the years, you know, there might be some learnings in that for others so they don't make the same mistakes.
Yeah, there'll be a scintilla of something really useful there, Jan, that we could tease out from what is a myriad of.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jan. And it's so good to recognise that we have moved on from that separation that, you know, you have seen more traditionally at universities, and the recognition that actually everyone is vital in how we operate as a university, and we all need to work together moving forward. So these panels are called bold conversations. And to me, when I hear the word bold, I have expectations that it might challenge us. It might make us feel a bit uncomfortable at times. We're probably going to be trying to be a bit creative and thinking outside the box. So what are you wanting to see and happen as these series of bold conversations as we progress? So maybe Jan, you get first bite this time.
I think these sorts of opportunities just to share in a fairly informal way often triggers thoughts in other people that could lead to something really innovative or creative, or at least act in an affirming way, or potentially, as you say, in a challenging, slightly discomforting way. But all of that's good, right? We're all learners within learning institutions. So it's very easy to get caught up in the busy work. And no doubt everybody is absolutely flat out. But taking time out to just stretch the boundaries a little bit, to think slightly differently, or to hear other people's perspectives, I think is a good thing for people who work in institutions that are filled with smart people.
Thanks, Jan. And Barney, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with Jan. I think that's what we're hoping to achieve. I think the other aspect of this, a couple of other aspects. One is I like the Trans-Tasman, you know, the opportunity to hear from Jan, who's got you know, obviously a deep knowledge of New Zealand and the New Zealand system and the challenges there, and also having come out of being a Vice-Chancellor in Australia, knows just how crazy it gets in Australia. So that's a unique perspective to bring.
It's the new Bledisloe Cup, matey.
Yeah, it's a new Bledisloe Cup. That's very true. Yeah, that's a bit challenging, I think, for us. However, but from in my perspective too, there are some really important, bold things to talk about in higher ed. And, you know, taking on today's topic is going to be a bit challenging. Neither Jan nor I is an expert in artificial intelligence, but, you know, we're watching and listening to the debate and the discussion going on. But that's just one example. And Jan touched on another one a second ago, changing nature and the blurring of work in higher education. That's an interesting topic. We might like to tackle that at some point. You know, we're watching now, and Jan and I had a great catch up this morning. We were just chatting about some of the things we're noticing. Student expectations of higher education are changing, and that would be interesting to understand what that means for us. The way our universities are developing as spaces and the role we play with our regions and the commitment we make. All of those things are important. So I think there are some nice topics I'm looking forward to chatting to Jan about, and then hearing from colleagues, throwing a few questions up at us and comments, challenging us a little bit as well about what they're hearing, and also throwing some ideas into the mix. So, plus, I think it also gives us, Jan and I, as patrons, an opportunity to be seen as patrons. And, you know, that's a great way of connecting with the membership of ATEM.
Well, thank you. I think it's going to be a really exciting series, and I'm looking forward to hearing how it progresses and the different topics that get explored. Now, I think ATEM were probably quite bold in the title that they chose for this first conversation, given that they've got two esteemed vice-chancellors posing the question of, could they be replaced by artificial intelligence? I think is quite an interesting one for us. So this is a conversation, as Barney just alluded to. We are going to be hearing, and I'm going to be posing some questions to Jan and Barney, but we also want you to be involved. We want you to be thinking about what you want to say, how you want to challenge the conversation as we go on. So please do use the meeting chat. Make sure that your name's quite clear in the chat that you go along. And what we'll do is, as we come towards this latter part of the section, we'll be taking some of those questions and posing them to Jan and Barney. You can have the opportunity to pose them yourselves, or if you'd rather me read them out, then I'm happy to do that as well. But yes, please be interactive. Please let us know what your thoughts are as we're going through. So, first question then, well, the first point is, you know, the end of November last year, we saw ChatGPT break into the scene. There's other apps as well, but since then it has been a hot topic. There was some people, some educational facilities, university school, that made some quite quick reactions as about how they were going to tackle this. I think some of that has been reversed and rethought out. But we have definitely suddenly experienced a whole new level of sophistication when it comes to artificial intelligence, and it is quite amazing. You've probably all actually interacted with artificial intelligence over the last 24 hours and may not have been aware of it in some ways. And this morning I read the Campus Morning Mail, as we all do first thing in the morning, and they announced that there is now a ChatGPT version 4, which is going to be positioned for doing teaching. So rather than actually giving answers, it's actually going to take a Socrates kind of approach and give questions back to the learner to help them having a learning experience as they go along. So it'll be interesting to look at how that goes. So we want to explore really what artificial intelligence means for the world and what it means for higher education in particular. So let's start off and find out what your experience has been so far. So perhaps we'll start with you, Barney. Have you played yet with ChatGPT or any equivalent platform, and what did you think of it?
Yeah, I have. But it wasn't ChatGPT. It was a platform called ChatSonic, which I think I was reading an article somewhere, and it was discussing different generative AI platforms that were emerging. And ChatSonic was interesting because, unlike ChatGPT, as I understand it, ChatGPT is its training set of data that it draws from in the way it formulates responses is locked down in I think up to about 2021. So it's been learning from that massive data set. So I started having a look at ChatSonic because it has access to the internet. So its data set it learns from is being taken out of the real time, in a sense, out of the internet. And I did it in a couple of ways, just out of curiosity. One was that I'm not sure what Jan has done with her Board of Trustees or Council, but we needed to tell our Council something about our Board of Trustees, about what generative AI was going to mean and what we were going to do about it. And Romy, I know Flinders, I think in South Australia, has made some early forays here about how you're going to manage it. So you might have a comment to make here as well. So I thought, well, if I'm going to produce a paper for the board on this, I better ask Chat Sonic to do it. So I went on board and I posed a question about a paper on the challenges and the opportunities of using generative AI in universities in Australia in 2023. And I need 500 words, thanks very much. And about 3.5 seconds later, I had 500 words on the topic. We then used that paper, and I can talk about why it wasn't really fit for purpose in a way, but nevertheless, we did use it alongside our own paper. Simon Barry, the DVC academic here, put our paper together about it. But we said, look, just so you know, there's a Chat Sonic version to follow. That was interesting. I think he might have actually gone to ChatGPT and used that. I'd used Chat Sonic. The other thing I started to do just for a little while with colleagues was where I was emailing to a senior colleague with a particular issue. I actually asked Chat Sonic what the answer would be. And then I sent the answer along with my comment to a colleague. And I said, look, this is the, whatever the issue might have been. And by the way, to save us all time, I went onto generative AI to get the answer, which is attached. And I made it very clear that, there was a human being somewhere in this process. So yes, sorry, it's a long-winded answer. I have had a play with it. And it's been interesting. Just Chat Sonic is, at the moment, is interesting as a platform. You get 75 questions a month that you can use, 25 in a day. So you can do a little bit of exploring topics with it. And it had some fact, we might like to draw out some of the insights, but yes, I've played with it. I'm interested in it. I think we might like to tease out in a moment just what implications it might have broadly as well as in higher ed. But it's here, it's with us, it's developing. Version 4 of ChatGPT. Imagine what the next 5 years will deliver. So we have got a technology disruptor here that is interesting and pretty challenging. I'm not sure if, Jan, you've...
It is, and just to say, great couple of examples there, Barney, just before I go and ask Jan the same question. But, the other thing that we have to accept is, when ChatGPT first came out, it was using data up to 2021, but the more we feed into it, the more it's learning. So the acceleration rate is actually massive. So it is using a lot more current data, and it's just going to keep on growing and developing at such a pace. It's going to be very interesting to see. Jan, what's your experience?
I had such a lot of fun over the Christmas break with this. I was in Perth with family, and my son, who's a veterinarian in practice there, and we fed in pathology questions, veterinary pathology questions into it, and spat out answers, and we were loving it. It was like, the entertainment of the moment. But it is, a very spectacular technological advance. And it is here, and we do need to embrace it and understand it better, and also find ways to effectively work with it and potentially regulate it. Like we do with any technological advancement, it changes things, and we can't deny that change. So I find it quite exciting about how we might progress with this, but it is the same as any technological advancement in many ways. It's been quietly building all around us, with our smartphones, with our Internet of Things, smart cities, smart farms, those sorts of things. And then I think back through my entire career, I can remember when I was a young girl, my dad holding a slide rule saying, you need to work out, I'm going to teach you how to use a slide rule because you'll need to use it all the time. And then, within 2 years, there were calculators for school kids at school. And so it's gone on. It is just the human condition that we continue to find these things to improve, advance our lives, but also they have shadow sides that we need to manage as a society. So for me, it's an exploratory phase for this sort of technology. It's no doubt it's going to advance more. It's going to develop, if it hasn't already developed, all the biases that all the data that it goes into. One of my bigger challenges is around whether and how, like many technologies have, it leads to greater separation between the haves and the have-nots globally. What does this mean for, families in Bangladesh, et cetera, et cetera. So some of those sorts of more of a sort of a moral social question around, gaps in technology across the world will be interesting, because this has really advanced those who have this technology quite significantly. I mean, I heard someone say yesterday, and I think it's very true, this sort of technology, generative AI, is not going to replace people, but people are going to be replaced by people who know how to use generative AI. And that's, so I think we have to look at it not in a sort of a naive way, but in a realistic way. How can we best utilize this? What are the pluses and minuses? Is there a need to regulate? What does that look like? And what it does for us at universities is it really calls us to think about what we are as a university, what we mean by assessment and credentialing. And really it exposes poor assessment, if it wasn't already exposed by other knowledge bases that we have around how students learn. It's certainly going to be exposed by this sort of technology.
And
Well,
just
some great points there, Jan. Barney.
Sorry, just pick up one point of that. I think that I mean, we're all reading a lot of articles about ChatGPT and what it's being used for, and some troubling ones about the biases in the data set, and some of those ethical considerations that Jan just touched on, which I think we're all concerned about. I think even Elon Musk was being quoted this week about his concerns, and he started OpenAI as one of the founding investors. So there's an element here that we have to be very careful of. I think that people have been able to trigger some pretty challenging responses from generative AI by the way they frame certain questions, picking up the biases in the data set. And I do think, I'm not sure it's a regulatory response that's going to be required, but I do think that, we need to be very, very careful. I mean, there are many ways you could explore Wikipedia, or you could explore the internet and find some pretty shocking ways in which information can be distorted. So I do think that ethical dimension, while we play with it and we start to see the disruptive possibilities of it, I think it's exciting, but we do need to take our human lens to what AI is going to do in this space.
A great start to the conversation, and started to touch on so many things which we will try and pick up and perhaps go into a bit more detail as we go along. But I think, that equity issue is really important. Where it goes as far as how we design our learning and our assessments, really important. There's a lot of things to take on from that. So I am going to ask the cheeky question, and I think you started to touch on this. Barney, you said, well, we wrote a paper for our council, but we had to do some more work on it. Jan, you talked about needing the human factor in these things. So could AI take over a role like a vice-chancellor role? Jan, what do you reckon?
And who could tell? I don't know about Barney, but I have an amazing team of really good people. And actually, for me, most of my job is dealing with people and the individuals and the human dimension of work. And so it's hard to imagine, although I won't say it's not impossible, but certainly what I've seen so far, to be able to replicate the human relational aspects of being a vice-chancellor, which to me are more important than just about anything else. So it's hard to believe that could replace a vice-chancellor because of that singularity. And the other thing is, vice-chancellors we certainly use data and are aware of our past, but we're always future oriented. And that is at the moment one of the challenges for these sorts of things, because it is just really around data that's come in so far. But on the other hand, I asked it to write a strategic plan for Massey University. It did an okay job. in 3 seconds. But it was pretty much like every other strategic plan for any other university that, you know, you might be able to identify around the world. So it doesn't yet have that spark of creativity, contrariness, and chutzpah that most vice-chancellors would have in terms of planning for a future and shaping the personality and impact of their own particular university in a way that's different to other universities.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, you know, Barney gave the example, it was a good starter to use it for the paper. Catherine's put in the chat that she used it to draft a policy. But again, it was better than starting from a blank piece of paper, but it wasn't the end product that we needed. But I think it's really interesting what you're pointing on around the humanistic element of what mankind brings to roles. And, you know, I think that's what we perhaps have to think about as educators, that we need to not educate for the things that can be done by, you know, technology, but think about what that value add is, what those points of distinction are, and think about how we bring in humanistic education into higher education to actually help our graduates become the, you know, employability and have the skills that they need into the future. Barney, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree with Jan. The next VC is not going to be AI because of all of those reasons. The role is a complex one involving the relationships we have with our colleagues, with our students, with our external stakeholders and supporters and governments, and it's certainly not a black and white role. It's a nuanced role in a whole range of ways. So I can't imagine how that might be managed now, but of course AI is developing at a great rate of knots. And interesting that Jan asked it to do Massey's strategic plan. I asked ChatSonic to do Western Sydney's strategic plan, and it did come back in 3 seconds. But it was, and it was a mediocre strategic plan. It said some of the things you'd expect it to say. It had found data, it had crafted it together in a way that it felt was a strategic plan for a higher education institution of this context. It knew something about Western Sydney University, as it did about Massey, because its data set includes that sort of information. So it generated something, but it wasn't even a starting point. And I think this was one of those differences that's so important for us to appreciate. And I'll relate it to one of the COVID things we all noticed about Zoom, which is the lack of the liminal spaces in our lives when we were Zooming from one thing to another. There's an important period of reflection and engagement and consultation that we need to have on a whole range of things, formally and informally, in universities. And if you think about strategic planning as an example of that, strategic planning, we did one in the heart of the challenge of 2020, when we're all grappling with what the future might look like. And as a university, we thought, no, maybe this isn't a bad time to get people to start thinking about the future, hopefully not dystopian, but the future, and how we manage our way through it. And there was a wonderful process of engagement over several months. Zoom was a great technology to use to help us to communicate in that time. And it became richer and richer the more we engaged together, the more we reflected, the more we pulled in some data, we thought about the future and being resilient, and the engagement between colleagues was so important. Now, ChatSonic took 3 seconds and generated something, but the richness of that human interaction about our organization, our university, was so crucial to framing what I think is a really impressive plan that came out of that process. So that's why I'm confident that leadership and the people dimension of what a vice-chancellor does is not going to be easily overridden by artificial intelligence, but there are various ways I think it can help the process. And I think we're touching on some of that already in the questions coming up on the chat side of things. But no, I think Jan beautifully covered it. I think there is such a dimension to our role. But, you know, we're often interested in pretty speedy analysis of things. I mean, this is, right now I'm on the Australian Universities Accord review panel. And so we're very interested in exploring elements of our terms of reference and getting deep into the data. Now, I think AI is going to help in future in actually very rapidly and hopefully in an interesting way, bringing data to our attention. But Jan's comment too, that a lot of what I see lacks creativity and nuance and that forward thinking, the innovation that people bring to the challenging questions we have to face. And that's very true. One of the things in the Accord I'm noticing is people bring us data that cut in a way I've never seen before, because someone's being creative about the way they're describing things correlated together in the sector. And that can be a very powerful moment to say, okay, let's understand better what's happening. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to get that level of creativity out of ChatSonic. So no, I don't think the next Vice-Chancellor will be AI.
Well, thank you both for tackling that cheeky question. I really liked where you went with the fact about the engagement piece, Barney, and it is, you know, sometimes what the magic is about the process, not the end product.
I think
it's taking people with you.
That's a really good point. And I think now, of course, the version 4 has this ability to teach as well as to provide answers. But, you know, process can sometimes be more important than endpoint in the way in which we lead our colleagues, particularly in, you know, really challenging moments. So no, I think it's a really important point.
So let's talk a bit more about employability in general. You know, artificial intelligence is here to stay. We'd be foolish not to embrace it. But I suppose there's quite often the challenge that comes about when we get a new technology, that it talks about whether or not it's going to disrupt jobs or it will create more jobs than it displaces. So I suppose my question is your thoughts on how do you think artificial intelligence is going to impact employability and the skills of the future? And what can universities do to prepare graduates for a future that has got AI in it? Barney, why don't you go first this time?
Okay. Look, I think we're all pondering this question because every time there's a technological disruption, it's followed by often a societal disruption, and then an equilibration, and then an emergent growth in jobs and prosperity as that technology opens up new opportunities. And that's the sort of history of the cycle we're in. It's whether it's the industrial revolution and whether it's modernizing agriculture or the manufacturing sector or the digital age that we're in now. So I think we're always hopeful, being an optimistic person, that technology disruption will work our way through this, and emerging from it will be some of the things I'm seeing in the chat, the way in which our jobs will change, not just our jobs will change because of having the capacity to use an AI platform to really save us a lot of time and often routine activity, sometimes slightly creative things we're doing as we extract information we need for the role we might be in at the time, and then take the human dimension to that and the engagement and the socializing and so on. I think those elements will change the nature of our jobs, and naturally we always gravitate away from transactional aspects of the working life, and we gravitate towards the softer skills that are going to be needed in the future, and that will change the nature of higher education. We're already engaged in that. Technology had already started to disrupt the transactional nature of many jobs. So that's just a continuation of it. What I think is really fascinating at the moment, because no one should be surprised about generative AI. Anyone who's seen a science fiction movie since about 1952 knows it's been coming. You know, hell has been a problem in various ways in science fiction for a long time. So we've known that something could emerge here that might be quite challenging for us. Now we're seeing some of that very rapidly becoming challenging. And in the same way any technology disruption is challenging, people are fearful about what is going to happen to my job. Is it going to make me redundant, or what I do, what I value? Is it going to change that? There will be significant changes. People are already talking about it in a positive way. What we've got to be very careful of, I think here, pick up Jan's point, I think we do need to think very carefully about the society that we want to have for our children and grandchildren to live in, because we may be very significantly disrupting through generative AI, and maybe that surge of prosperity might come in a different way, but it may not expand the labour market and jobs in the way we saw after previous industrial and other digital revolutions. So from my perspective, there is a real question for universities that I think we'll delve into. We'll do all the things universities do well. We'll explore this one. We'll engage with it. We'll find how we can use generative AI. We'll address the challenging ethical questions. We'll address the learning and teaching challenges and the research challenges it's going to face. But for our curriculum and our credentialing, that's going to become really interesting about how that changes the attributes our graduates need. I think Jan's comment early on about people who don't engage with generative AI are the ones who are going to be more at risk in terms of jobs in the future, which is true of digital competency generally. It's just taking it that one step further. So I don't have answers to it, but it is going to be more disruptive, I think, than people might have imagined.
I would have been surprised if you had full answers to it, Barney. You know, to be fair, it's a question that everyone's grappling with. I think, you know, we're right in taking Jan's point before. You know, equipment technology has been evolving for, you know, a long time, and so jobs and roles have had to evolve in that way. Perhaps what's different now is the accelerated pace of it. I suppose something that I'll just throw in there for you to consider that you might want to comment on at some point is, do you think it's going to change the work-life balance in that there will be more things that can be done with artificial intelligence? So it might mean that people can get a better balance of their work life, or is it just going to mean that there's different demands and we still keep working at the same pace? So that's just something to ponder on. But Jan, what do you think we need to be doing for universities to prepare our students?
Well, I certainly think this comes back to, you know, the transferable skills discussion, graduate attributes and so on. And it is part of the digital literacy piece. And so we need to make sure our students are able to operate in this space so that when they graduate, they bring those skill sets into the workplace. And, you know, I expect it to be, you know, normalised that our graduates will be capable of operating in this and also understand the various social and ethical dimensions of operating in this as they graduate from our universities. And jobs will come to expect it. So the nature of the job, you ask about work-life balance, I suspect we're still a long way from paperless office, you know, and that was like, 30 years ago. So the whole idea about suddenly us having loads of time on our hands doesn't seem to have played out with all the technology we have to date. And I got to say, I don't imagine this is going to free up an awful lot of that, but there will be higher expectations around these generative AI tools as research tools for us in the way that Barney has talked about. And it will just take all of that up to the next level. But for years, we've been talking about educating students for jobs not yet identified. Forever, we've been talking about that in my career. And so this is just a continuation of that. There are jobs nowadays that I never imagined would exist as legitimate jobs, but they do. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. But people who miss out on that digital literacy because of the digital divide in society or whatever will be very much the poorer for not having these sorts of skill sets and that higher order understanding of the constraints, limitations, and biases, etc., that we've talked about within these things. And that's where a university graduate really comes into their own, because university graduates have those sorts of skills, and they will become more important than ever.
Thanks for that, Jan. I suppose what we've been seeing in the higher education sector over the last few years is that we have to be also reinventing ourselves and thinking a bit differently. We can't just be thinking of a provider of degree programs at undergraduate and postgraduate level and higher degrees by research. We're going to be stuck like Kodak if that's how we think. So everyone's been exploring where we go with short courses, micro-credentials, digital badging, etc., etc. What part do you think artificial intelligence will have in this, and how it might be helping us accelerate that kind of way of working? Jan, do you want to have a go at that one first?
Yeah, I actually, people are moving more and more to collecting a sort of a portfolio of credentials of one sort or another, rather than having a linear progression through undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. And I think that plays well into the space of generative AI in some of those smaller information gathering pieces. But I'll come back to, what's been around for decades now, that sort of information is not equal to knowledge, is not equal to wisdom. And so in and amongst all of that, like a MOOC, like the availability of the World Wide Web back in the day, like the Google searches and so on, this is able to curate information at an incredible rate and in a way that's very digestible for people. So I think people will use it quite a lot. And even if it's just as the foundational information before they start embarking upon the construction of knowledge, or indeed the acquiring of wisdom down the track in their educational journey. So I think there certainly absolutely will be a place in this, both as a sort of a preparatory kind of thing, but also for accessing easily bite-sized chunks of information. But make no mistake, gathering information is not the same as having deep knowledge, and it's most definitely not the same as being wise.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, Jan. And I think, it might also prompt us to thinking as a university, are we there to verify of people's learning and understanding and application, rather than being necessarily the teaching element of it? So I sometimes use the phrase uberversity, as in, we're not the taxi firm without any taxis. Could we be at times, and I'm not saying all the time, the university where we can assess whether or not people are at the level that they need to be in order to be awarded a qualification, rather than being the teachers. And
Romy, I totally agree with some of those challenges, but I think if we are still basing our credentialing on the basis that they've kind of memorized and spat out information, then we've kind of got it wrong.
100%. So this has to be about application of that learning and show it in that way. And that's what we do, not a regurgitating of things. I'm with you there. Barney, I know Western Sydney is very involved in their thinking around lifelong learning. So what do you think artificial intelligence is going to do in relation to lifelong learning?
Look, I'm always positive about these things. I think it's a great tool. And I think, Jan's highlighted the way it can make a huge difference in a whole range of ways. And I gave the example of a paper to the Board of Trustees. There are many ways, in the sense that Jan was saying about preparation, to help us to get a starting point. Often the challenge in many of it, we're time poor people. And the quicker we can get to a starting point that we can work with, a really valuable, useful starting point that we can then add value to that. We're content experts, so we know our role. We know the challenge we're facing in developing a new policy or a procedure or providing some, complex communications to the organisation, and we want to frame it in a particularly structured way. Yes, these things can be enormously powerful tools to help us in that way, but then we can add enormous value to it, to conceptualize it and contextualize it in a way that is appropriate to the audience that we're working with. So I think it's going to be incredibly valuable. If you think about your question around micro-credentials and what's emerging here in Australia, we're having this big conversation everywhere in the world around flexible, stackable, modular, short courses with some credentialing around them. And how would AI work in that way? Well, I think AI will be a tool that we'll be accessing, but the challenge for universities is ensuring that we can measure the deep knowledge that's being imparted. People can't come away understanding and being able to be a scholar, to be able to contribute to knowledge, being able to speak with authority on the matters relevant to their discipline. And that takes a different level of learning and a different style of assessment and a different way that we might engage with all of the external environments that people need to be in. It might be in a school, in a clinical placement, in a work placement. There are various ways that this can be tested. The idea that it's a bit like the conversation we've been having around cheating websites and the fact that, how long can a person get through the system essentially using downloaded essays and just submitting them. At some point, in a capstone way, we have got to ensure that they exit and they obtain the credential that we're bestowing upon them, able to demonstrate that they are an expert in their field, and they can then contribute more broadly to society. So those are the challenges we have. And we might like to talk a little bit about how we might go about that, because, you know, one of the immediate responses, and this is a really interesting point, I think, around what happened during COVID, when we really did some rapid work on new assessment. You know, the online proctored examination is an element of that, but also moving away from examinations altogether and looking at other forms of assessment that are much more effective, possibly, in testing people's knowledge and if in the vet sector, their competencies and so on. Now, a lot of people, the immediate reaction to ChatGPT is, okay, let's get everyone in a giant space, in a desk in front of them with a piece of paper, with a pencil. Let's not have any technology there beyond the pencil, and an exam paper, and make sure we've checked them for any possible implant that might be conveying information to them, and go back a couple of 100 years in assessment. So that challenge exists, and talking to colleagues about that. In fact, some of the interesting things I've seen at Western Sydney on our internal Yammer social media platform, people are saying, well, I've got this exam question I often ask, and I've just given it to ChatGPT, and it gave me the answer so quick. And they're then despondent that, you know, they don't have a future. Well, other people are saying, well, there's a whole lot of ways you can use this technology and engage with it, and you're starting to see that. So I'm confident we're going to work our way through this. But one of the challenges, I think, to us is not to go backwards in time to resolve this. That's never worked with technology, right? I mean, I think, wasn't it the head of IBM who said that, you know, the world needed, when people were talking about desktop computing, said, no, most of the world needs 6 computers. And that's the end of the market. You know, really careful, you know, going backwards and imagining how we manage this by ignoring it.
Yeah,
you know, one of the suggestions, you know, in the chat I was just looking at a moment ago around just how much it can change the nature of admin for our colleagues, I think is a really interesting area.
There are, and I think you've got some great points. And I think there's 3 areas that I would still like to explore with you. And Jan, you started when we first spoke about, you know, assessment design and that learning experience. Barney, you've been touching on some of the integrity and ethical issues around it. And also, as I say, from the chat, we're getting questions about, well, what does it mean for staff, both academic and professional staff? So let's try and explore those 3 areas in the time that we've got left of this conversation. Then we'll go into some of the more direct questions from the chat. So Jan, do you want to talk a bit more about what your thoughts are about the learning experience and about how artificial intelligence, we need to think about it in order to be able to make sure that we are giving that rich learning experience, how we design assessment? Let's hear your thoughts in a bit more detail.
Yeah, and they aren't particularly well formed, Romy, because I think, you know, there are academics far more experienced and expert in this than me, but it seems to me it comes to us considering what is the point of assessment, why do we assess, what's the fundamental role of it, and there's multiple reasons why we assess. Not telling anyone anything that you don't know, but in part it's to ensure that the student has reached a certain level. In part, it's to motivate them to continue to work on the course materials or the subject matter that they are dealing with as a sort of a timekeeper. In part, it is to help them learn, because feedback's a critical part of assessment. So, you know, assessment that is, you know, more aimed at what you might expect a graduate to leave the university with, is always going to be both be able to address all of those 3 kind of roles of an assessment, a point of assessment. I mean, my thinking is that employers are probably not going to ask their new employees to come in and do closed book written tasks in a short period of time. So because they'll be expecting their new employee to utilise all the tools available to them, including generative AI, to produce that material. So then what is the what are employers looking for from graduates? It's how they go about accessing that, how they work with other people, how they then make, assimilate that information into their existing context. The strategic plan is a great example of that. There's no point just coming up with something generative that is generic. It needs to be tailored for the local environment. How they work with people, how they make other people better as a result of the interaction that they've had, how they present information, how they problem solve in novel situations. These are all the sorts of things that we should be assessing so that we can be sure that our graduates leave our universities with the skills that set them up for life, not just for their first employer, but for the changing nature of work over their career post-graduation. So it's around designing assessments that look to those sorts of things on the assumption that students will be able to access assimilated past information by generative AI programming as a baseline. It's a little bit like the difference between a closed book exam and an open book exam. You always, as a teacher, expect a much higher standard of answers in an open book exam than you do in a closed book exam. And I think that's going to just, accelerate or be amplified as a result of these changing technologies that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I think those are really strong principles, Jan, that you just outlined for us. And, given that we know that assessment drives learning and that we can make assessment authentic,
right.
It's going to make the learning authentic to where students need to be. So thank you for that. And I'll ask you the question. Oh, sorry, Jan.
Can I just add one little bit in there? One of the challenges that we'll face as universities is making sure our academics are well enough developed in their ability to provide useful feedback for students who are accessing generative AI and so on as part of their assessment. So that staff development piece becomes really important for universities to grapple with, probably sooner rather than later.
Right, and that was exactly where I was going to go into the staff piece with Barney. So perfect link. Thank you for that, Jan. So Barney, what are your thoughts about what this is going to mean for staff at universities? How it's going to aid them? What they have to look out for? Or how we perhaps have to, provide that new type of professional development for them?
No, look, it is all about professional development. I had the opportunity for an exchange with a colleague online the other day in our Yammer system who was wanting to know more deeply what the Board of Trustees had thought of the paper on generative AI and what sort of interventions we might expect as a result of that. He was very concerned, this particular academic mathematician, about the possible implications on the way in which he felt students would use generative AI in his case, in a mathematics context. Now, as a mathematician, I reflected back to him what I saw happen when I was an academic back in the 1990s, and a new technology came into mathematics, which was what are called computer algebra systems. Now, computer algebra systems were breakthrough technologies in the 1990s, came in the late 80s and 90s, which could do a lot of the symbolic manipulation that underpins mathematical modeling and evaluation. And suddenly you had a tool, and many of them could do a lot of the very standard mathematical calculations that were just embedded across all of our engineering mathematics programs, for example. And one of the interesting pieces of work, and this is why I'm confident about the future, that we did around Australia, around the world, would say, well, how do we take this new technology into the mathematics classroom? How does it change the way we teach? How do we use this technology when it knows how to solve a second order differential equation? It's very adept at it. It could be a black box, but it can also be a rich way of understanding from a constructivist approach what is really happening, why you need to structure solutions in a particular way, how you model a system and define the right structures to model a system, and then understand and use the tool to help you do what might be otherwise quite lengthy and tiresome calculations that are fraught with error. You know, in mechanical engineering, we wrote a major paper around using computer algebra systems in modeling 6-bar linkage mechanisms, which are quite complex in engineering. And to model them, they involve, you know, Fourier series, truncated Fourier series, and second-order differential equations, really complicated mathematics. But once you can use these systems powerfully to help students understand the real richness of the modeling, then you get a much more powerful outcome. They're adept at using an important piece of software, and they understand more deeply the underpinning mathematical concepts that are leading us to a model that actually is replicating behavior. So I'm confident that with the right form of professional development, we're going to help our colleagues to deal with this. I had an exchange with a radio astronomer the other day who was worried that his first assignment, which was about the James Webb Telescope, for his class, they'd all go away and use generative AI, and he'd be very disappointed they didn't learn anything. And I said, well, flip it around, bring it into the classroom, get them to use it, get them to critically assess what's going on here, add the value that you bring as an expert on radio astronomy to and optical astronomy to what this James Webb Telescope and all of this information they're getting, and use it as a point of discussion rather than saying I've now ruined an entire assessment task and we're doomed. The sky is falling. So professional development is crucial. Learn from each other. I love reading some of the things coming up at the moment where people are using generative AI in really interesting ways. And I'm thinking, okay, and I keep sending them to Simon Barry, my DVC academic, say, oh, this is a great idea. Are we thinking about that? And of course, he settles his Vice-Chancellor down and says, yes.
Right. So some great examples there. Nick Linnell in the comments has asked around it from the professional staff point of view, and I think you can take some of the things you've been talking about, Barney, about how we can use this kind of technology to actually streamline some of the practices that we have. We look at Deakin University quite a few years ago now, started using artificial intelligence as their front-facing kind of self-service help that they get. I think it's called Genie now. So we've already seen some great examples of how you can support, and it gets to a certain point and then we need to bring the human in.
I think as an example, Romy, on that, and I think it was touched on in the chat, I mean, our professional staff are really under pressure. Jan said that. Yeah. It's true, whether it's New Zealand or Australia or anywhere in the world. We expect a lot of them. There's 160 pieces of legislation that govern Australian universities. It'd be similar in New Zealand. And we're often dealing with, okay, we've now got to respond. Give you an example. In Australia, the Fair Work legislation is bringing in changes around sexual harassment and the way our policies, procedures, and our communication to staff needs to reflect these new policies of the Fair Work Commission. Now, that's a very important piece of work. Now, you can find generative AI that could help in much more rapidly, bringing us to the point where we have material to consult with, we have opportunity to engage with our colleagues, to disseminate information. I think we're going to find it a great tool to help us to take some of the pressure off and enable us to add value to the work that we do. That's what I really think we can see here. The 80-20 world that we have to live in, 20% of it's not going to get done, or it's not going to be as good as it could be because of the pressure we're under. I think we might be able to see that addressed here. That's what I'm hoping for. So I do think for our professional staff, there's a big opportunity here. But again, let's share best practice and what people are doing and great ideas. And also, where are the ethical problems? Where are the biases? Where are the challenges? This is not a cookie cutter. Institutions are different. How do we make sure that we're bringing a nuance and the forward-looking dimension to it?
So I think this has been an amazingly positive conversation about embracing AI and how we can, take it forward from two very influential vice chancellors. But there still is the question that people are asking about, well, what about the ethics around it? What about the integrity? What about the legal challenges? So perhaps you could just give us a few examples of what you've been putting in place within your institutions to deal with some of those things.
Well, I'll take it first, Jan, if you like. Look, as Jan said before, we're all learning here. We're all finding our way through this little complex scenario or set of scenarios that might emerge. So obviously, I think we're all doing the same sorts of things. One, we're obviously giving guidance, because right now people are, teaching in our autumn semester here, and they're prepared a whole lot of material, and they're now engaging with their students and thinking, well, how much integrity am I going to be able to guarantee in the assessment tasks I'll be setting, and the way in which I'm going to conduct teaching and learning and engage with students this semester. So that's the need for guidance, the need for support, the need for assistance is going to be sharp at the moment as we explore this. So there's a set of policy documents, there's a set of guidance documents that are being developed, and there's consultation going on where I think, like everyone, we're getting people together and we're talking about it, and we're trying to learn from each other. I've spent time overseas in the last month in Indonesia and India, meeting with fellow VCs and different universities, and they all ask the same question: what are you doing? Can we have a joint webinar on generative AI in teaching and learning? So everyone is grappling with it and wanting guidance and understanding best practice. Yes, Turn It In, I'm sure, is also looking at how we can do more to detect pretty outrageous examples of this is straight out of ChatGPT, and to a certain extent you see data on that. So there's a dimension, I think, in terms of integrity we'll all be looking at as we begin to see a response to that. The ethical dimension in terms of what goes on in the classroom, I think, is a really interesting learning opportunity. I hope that's the way people see it. As we see the flaws, let's draw them out to enrich the learning experience. But I guess the bottom line is we are learning together on this one. I think we need to be upbeat and confident about the future. I don't have any doubt about that. We need to be openly sharing, I think, information as far as we can. And I think our DVC's academic are engaged in that at the state level, at the national level, I'm sure, in New Zealand. And I think more of that needs to come into the conversation about best practice and problem solving and disasters,
So it's interesting, we're all grappling. I'm looking at a couple of the questions that have come in. So the ATEM team have got a bit of a theme with some of their questions. So ML and then Tony Brown have been asking about pace, and can we as universities keep up with the pace? So, Jan, what's your thoughts? Can we, and if we can't, what do we need to do in order to keep up with the pace?
The pace is a really interesting thing. We've seen a massive explosion in the last few months, and it's scared people that that's going to continue and continue and continue. But I suspect, like many other sort of innovations or introduction of disruptor technologies, it tends to be that, and then it starts doing that a little bit more. Like you think about cameras on phones, the first time a camera went into a phone, that was like amazing, and then each time it's like a bit more improvement in the camera, a bit more improvement in the camera, and we'll learn to live with that sort of so a big step change at the beginning. Where I wanted to go, Romy, was actually for us in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There's an added dimension here. We have the Tariti o Waitangi, and the role of Māori knowledge, mātauranga Māori, te reo Māori, tikanga Māori, wānanga Māori, all of those things are absolutely critical for how we do education in New Zealand. So far, the generative AI tools are quite, Western leaning. And so, we have to be really aware of, the new technological colonization and the risk of that, and not get too excited about that in Aotearoa. So I don't know how that is going to play out in Aotearoa, but pace is certainly not something that is going to comfort me around our obligation and aspiration to tangata whenua Māori people in New Zealand. So for me, that there are risks here. I mean, it doesn't really do Te Reo Māori. I've asked it a few questions in Te Reo Māori, and it's not that great. I mean, sure, I'd classify it as a learner, but it's so what does that mean for nations like Aotearoa New Zealand, which are genuinely bicultural and aspiring to be bilingual and working in ways that are different? We just have to be really mindful of the excitement of these sorts of things can override some of the things that we actually value quite significantly. We talked around the benefit of co-construction of strategic plans, getting together and talking about things. And so pace of the technological advancement may be too fast for the way humans generally can discuss, assimilate and take best advantage of. And I'm not too worried by that. We go as fast or as slow as we need to go. And certainly in Aotearoa New Zealand, I'll be very mindful of some of those sorts of elements to these sorts of technological advancements.
That's a very good point, Jan. I think that the cultural biases, we're coming back to those early comments we made about not really knowing what the data set is that it's drawing from, vast that it is, and growing as people interrogate it. This is often a question of bias in a whole range of ways, that we have Western bias in many, many things. And, if we don't consciously address that, then it perpetuates those biases. And that, I think, is a real risk here. And again, there is a very vital role for universities to play here in calling that out. And I agree with you, that cultural dimension is a crucial one in Australia at a time when we're addressing the voice to Parliament in a year of a referendum, engaging with First Nations people, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. This is the profoundly important moment for Australia. And we need to ensure that in Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous languages, without having, unfortunately, the scale of bicultural context that New Zealand has in Australia, we have perhaps a more challenging dilemma here to work through. And that's why universities again play this crucial role of awareness raising and exposing those very serious ethical challenges. And I think for those who are developing these systems, that they're called to task on this, as they have been already.
And as always, universities operate as thought leaders and significantly influence society by negotiating these challenging areas, or areas that are unknown for society, in a way that helps people understand and translate that into their everyday. So I think we have a really, it's an important role probably now more than ever, as we go through this incredible tumultuous change that's happening across the world in many dimensions, but we're talking about the technology at the moment.
And I think that what's coupled with that, in a way, is that it's not just us being changed. It's not just universities being changed. It's every facet of society that's being impacted by this. And even some of the fundamentals around the ethical constructs that need to be taken account of in AI are being questioned.
Yes.
Whether they're culturally relevant or how they're being interpreted. Even beneficiation, which should be a fundamental of any AI system. It should be about what benefit to mankind, to humankind, can be generated by a system, but that it can be contextually interpreted in a way that may not be the same for one group compared to another. So this is where universities are going to play a vital role, as always, in stepping up and not just being the technology experts that can actually develop the systems, but to have the ethicists and the philosophers and the humanists and those that are deeply immersed in the challenges that this is going to bring if we don't manage it well. And these things can get out of hand quickly. Just you look at it now, the tens of millions of people that are now using ChatGPT and the way that it's being monetized. You know, the way people can generate content really quickly in a content-rich world, when you're often, the quicker you get content onto a platform, the quicker you can monetize that platform. Now they have a tool available to generate content, questionable content, but available to them. These are really presenting some challenges about where that content has come from. And perhaps one other thing I wanted to mention, I didn't mention students before, and I know it's come up in the chat. I mean, we need to be talking to our students about every dimension of this so that they're not left as concerned as many of our academic staff are. So there's a communication and engagement with our student body that's so crucial.
Barney, some really interesting points there about that cultural bias and how we have to take a role in that. I think also right at the beginning, Jan, you talked about the equity issue, about who can actually access this and how it might widen the gap. You know, again, I think this is something that universities should be involved in and think about how do we do something about that. I'm aware of the time. Unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of our conversation, but I just wanted to give Jan and Barney final couple of minutes each just to say anything else and round up really what their thoughts are about what the future is as far as AI. So Jan, over to you.
There are moments like this in time that can be quite unsettling for people. Some of the foundational things that they've always kind of used as a touchstone are now being shaken. But as we've done in the past, we as a society are going to continue to be able to adapt to the way society is changing. I think the thing that gives me most optimism in all of that is our universities are filled with smart, educated, outspoken people who are just incredible in the way that they can assimilate, predict, and really utilise that information in a way that guides both the curriculum, our research questions that we ask, and our communities that we serve. And I see no difference in this compared to everything else. So while it does, you know, when you start to get a little bit, start to catastrophize things, it's worth just pausing and thinking back to many other technological innovations that came in. You know, video was going to destroy movie theatres, you know, those sorts of things that we've heard over the years. And actually, I think we're in a very good position. We're really poised to be able to capture opportunity, assist our communities in assimilating new technology that's going to make a lot of the sort of grind, the sort of technical research that goes into informing decisions made by humans that much easier. So for me, it's an exciting time. I have no answers for it, but I'm absolutely confident our people will find really good answers for it.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And Barney, your final thoughts?
No, look, I agree with Jan. It is an exciting time. There's no doubt about that. And we've experienced many of these exciting moments. This one actually may be at a level that perhaps surprises us, but that's a good thing. And I agree absolutely at the role universities are going to play crucially in this, in every dimension of it, and particularly to help more broadly in society to work through some of the challenges we've talked about. So I'm confident about the future, and I'm confident that we'll navigate it, and it will improve, and it will become more pervasive, and it'll become more challenging. But I think fundamentally, the advantages are significant, and we'll embrace them. I noticed that one of our colleagues, Catherine Whittingham, bothered to ask ChatGPT a question about whether a Vice-Chancellor could be replaced by AI. Fortunately, the answer, Jan, is no. There are a few things Vice-Chancellors have to do that are perhaps a little more significant than that. And it touched on emotional intelligence in its answer, and complexity, and ethical questions that can arise that perhaps a Vice-Chancellor is best equipped rather than an AI platform to do. That could have saved us the entire webinar. Thanks, Catherine. So no, I'm positive about the future.
The conversation has been so much richer than just that conversation. So I'm going to round it off here. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Barney, for such a wonderful initial first bold conversation. I'm really excited about where the series goes and what topics are involved. I have a confession. I used ChatGPT to generate my questions for this session. You know, it does give you that baseline. But thank you for letting me be involved in this. Jan, Barney, thank you. And I'm going to pass over to ML.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much,
everyone.
Bart.
Thanks, Romy. Thanks, Barney. Thanks, Jan. Barney just said that technology brings us exciting moments, and I actually think this is one of them. I was reflecting about how often do we get the chance to come together and hear our Vice-Chancellors in conversation, not as a short article in Campus Morning Mail or some such, but actually to sit and explore in depth and hear different perspectives and have that tussle of what does this mean, what does this look like. So for me, this has been so exciting. I've had a couple of, I've had quite a few people texting me who are in the audience saying how much this is topping their bucket up, that it's, it's helping challenge and stimulate and all of those things that we want to do. So I would, I just want to first of all share that this is an exciting moment, this first bold conversation. So thank you very much. Possible. I would like to do a very big thank you to Jan and Barney as our patrons. When we've come together to talk about the role of patron, they have said they don't want it to be a traditional role. They want it to be an active role where they actually really push us as an association and the sector to explore different elements. And you have really embraced that today. So I think, can we do sort of an Auslan or sign language round of applause to say thank you? Thank you so much. It has been fantastic. You have topped our buckets up big time, and we can't wait for the next conversation. We need to do another thank you as well, Romy. It's a tough gig being asked to come in and facilitate the conversation between two Vice-Chancellors, but you have done an amazing job. You've kept the conversation flowing and really added some dimensions to it. We've spoken about thought leadership, and I think this conversation really has led into that space to spark some of those ideas as well. So could we all give Romy a big round of applause as well? Thank you. For all of those who've done the poll, thank you. There is a little survey that we will send out. It might pop up in the chat, but we are going to let you head off into your morning or afternoon, wherever you are, with a couple of minutes spare. And I hope you are filled with lots of things. Like I keep saying, top up your bucket, but you are going back to your workplace. You're going to turn around to your colleagues and say, I just heard this. What do you think about? And let's start spreading this conversation as well. Go well, everyone, and thank you for joining us.